Hello and welcome to the Bloodstream Podcast, a show serving the greater bleeding disorders community, brought to you by Believe Limited and Bloodstream Media, and made possible thanks to our presenting sponsor, Takeda. I'm your patient advocate and host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your healthcare advocate, nonprofit nerd, and your other host, Amy Bradford, reminding you to please speak with a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
On today's show, alternative funding programs. What is that?
It's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing.
I learned it's a whole thing.
Also known as a nightmare. But we've got some good people, Zack, Duffy, and Roland, Lamy from the Hemophilia Alliance, to break it down and tell you what to look out for. There's also a project that HFA is a part of called the ECHO Project. It's providing CME credits to HCPs in a series called Recognition and Care of Women and Bleeding Disorders, right? This is a session that's about increasing awareness of women with bleeding disorders amongst healthcare professionals. That's important. We have details. And the latest gene therapy segment about common myths or misperceptions about the treatment. That's a part of today as well. We have got all of that. And yes, even more on today's episode. Welcome to Bloodstream.
Listeners, thank you for joining us today, as always. And if you like what you hear, share and subscribe to all the things. Share on the social media. Tell your friends about it. We love y'all. And subscribe wherever you listen to those podcasts.
A great idea. I also want to remind you, dear listeners, that the Bloodstream Podcast is made possible by our presenting sponsor, Takeda. Yes, that's right. Takeda. Takeda's got this website, bleedingdisorders.com, where you can learn all about Takeda's resources for and commitment to the bleeding disorders community. Takeda believes in a world free of bleeds. Amy Bradford, how about that?
How about that?
And they're dedicated more than ever in their efforts to offer a wide range of programs and support to help patients throughout their treatment journey, wherever on that journey they may be. In fact, I went to a Takeda-supported dinner during the BDC in Atlanta, talked all about treatment journeys. We got to do a little art project. It's quite a lot of fun, and the food was pretty good. Anyway, you can learn more about everything other than the food at bleedingdisorders.com. One more time, that's bleedingdisorders.com. And for their founding and ongoing support of the Bloodstream Podcast, I would just like to say thanks, Takeda.
Thank you, Takeda. Okay, before we go, I have to ask about the jacket. You're legitimately wearing a new jacket, and I haven't seen it. And it's also a Yankees jacket.
Couple things. Number one, you were wearing a blanket until about 3 minutes ago.
Nope, still have it. It's around. It's freezing in here, listeners.
So that's answer number one. It's freezing in here. But number two, the New York Yankees are in the playoffs.
They are.
Oh, Amy, come on. It's baseball playoffs. I know I don't really care about baseball, but it's early October. It's been this way our entire lives.
I know, the whole time.
But here's the thing. This jacket, Amy Board, you say new because I don't wear it a lot.
Yeah.
Can you read that little number on that patch?
1996.
This is a 28-year-old jacket. There's nothing in my office, there's very little in my home that I have had materially longer than I have had this New York Yankees jacket for the first championship in my lifetime. I'm just saying.
Oh my gosh.
And it still fits. Which at my current size, here's the thing. When this used to still fit, it was like, yeah, because when I was 12, 13 years old, I was a big inhibitor.
A delight.
I was a rotund delight.
You were a delight.
A rotund delight. And then as I leaned out a little bit, I was like, oh, the jacket still fits, even as I get bigger and taller.
Did you just find it?
No, it's playoff time, Amy. We just covered this. I got to bring it right now. There's some stuff going on in the world, including the New York Yankees, all right? So go Yankees.
That's so great. 1996.
And there's still a world where we could get a Yankees-Dodgers World Series, which the top two offensive players in baseball play for those two teams. It would be pretty epic. So
and
fingers
one
crossed.
of them's in your town.
And the other one's where I'm from.
Huge for you.
This is a big deal for me.
It's huge for you.
I would like nothing more than to dedicate the balance of this episode's time to discussing the role of the Yankees in my life. Is that approved?
That's so approved. Let's do this.
Fantastic. Takeda will be thrilled.
Oh my God.
So the good to talk about this jacket. I'd like to ask you about your trip to Virginia for the science fair.
Oh my gosh. We visited the Virginia Bleeding Disorders Foundation for their medical symposium, and we took the science fair roadshow, and it was just wonderful. It has been so fun for me as a former executive director to go around and see my friends in their communities and to see the communities across the country. It's just been so much fun. There were so many people that came up to me and said that they loved the podcast. They listened to the podcast. There were so many people that loved the education about the science fair. It was just one of those like feel good trips and experiences. Shout out to Kelly and Heather who work at that chapter who have really crafted just an incredible community. I mean, you know, it's at a water park. It's at one of those like Great Wolf Lodges.
Oh, yeah.
And I asked Heather, I was like, how in the world do you get these people to come to your education meeting? And she goes, we just...
Water slides.
Seriously, like water slides or this. And they have created a culture where people show up.
Right.
And she's like, it took years and years and years. But like they have a culture where if you are there for that education, you are engaged, you are there, you are part of that conversation. And it was so visible that that's how it was. So hats off to not only Kelly and Heather, but all of the chapter leaders and staff that are working across the country. Like they are boots on the ground. They're the people that are making it happen, and it's awesome.
It's a very cool part of what we do, in my opinion.
I think so too.
We get to step a foot into these different communities across the 50 states and communities around the world to just see how do things operate here? What's the culture like in this place? What brings people out? It's a privilege, frankly, and a very cool way for me in the last 12 years to have gotten to see parts of the country, meet people from certain walks of life I otherwise never would have met. Yeah. So just like a really special opportunity. It also, I want to share, Amy, brings me some personal satisfaction to hear you speak as a former executive director who appreciates what we're now able to provide for executive directors and their staff. I think that's a really cool, I mean, that was part of the vision of bringing you here is like bring that lens, bring that perspective so that when we show up other places, we're able to provide for people what they most need, the people who are running these events.
Absolutely.
So it was cool to hear you reference that.
PJL, tell me a little bit I'm sorry, I jumped in, but I'm just curious.
It's a podcast back and forth. You're allowed to talk really at any time.
I really want to hear about this HFA Project Echo. You sent me information about this, which...
Amy, look at this.
I
this
know.
is important.
It happens at least every other day. But I just thought it was a cool thing that HFA is doing. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Sure. No, thanks for bringing it up. So I hadn't heard anything about this, and there's a session coming up. It's labeled session 3. So this has been going on at least for 2 previous sessions.
I know, yeah.
But Project Echo, recognition and care of women with bleeding disorders. So the idea here is a focus on iron deficiency and bleeding disorders. There's some key stats that are cited. I'll read those quickly. Their initial work, their pilot paper, found that 44% of participants who are women with bleeding disorders at HTC, so these are diagnosed women who are currently part of the HTC network, had a positive history of anemia. And according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention Community Counts program, 12% of individuals with bleeding disorders have anemia. So this session takes a look at these statistics and how they are addressed in clinical settings, because we are clearly seeing a little bit of a discrepancy there. But the thing that I'm most excited about, more than the precise content of this session, which is one of many, is the fact that HFA is one of the partners. There's a few organizations, I believe, that are a part of this. Forgive me if I'm misspeaking. But CME, that is continuing medical education. That means this session that's taking place, an hour-long session, that's coming up on October, where is it? I lost it. October 28th. That 1-hour session means that any OBs, GYNs, or healthcare providers who work with women outside the treatment center setting have an opportunity to get continuing medical education credits. Talk about incentives, right? If you want to bring patients and families out to a family education weekend, provide food and water slides. If you want medical professionals to pay attention to what you're doing, having that program be CME aligned is a great way to do so, because these providers need these credits to continue their certification. So, Amy, in my opinion, I was so excited about this because we talk to ourselves a lot about the needs, particularly as it relates to women with bleeding disorders. And one of the things I'm always wondering about is what are we doing to reach providers outside of the Hemophilia Treatment Center network, non-expert hematologists, OBs, GYNs, dentists, so that we don't have these diagnostic odysseys as such commonplace stories going forward.
Right. I think as you were talking, I think a cool thing, listeners, this is something to send to your providers, I think. Thinking about it from an OBGYN standpoint, maybe sending it to their office. They do need these CMA credits, so it's not like you're sending them, something that won't be useful to them.
Exactly.
This is just one, the session 3, iron deficiency. So it makes us believe that there will be more.
Mm-hmm.
We heard about this through an email, through HFA's email. So if you're not on their email
Great point.
mail serve, like you can go to their website, I'm sure, and sign up for their emails to get more information like this. But I think this is a great thing for your providers. So if you can think of some people that maybe it would be helpful to have this type of continuing education, that's a really great resource.
So we'll have a link in the program notes. Yeah. Really, really big on those program notes. So that'll be there October 28th, 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time. Great point by Amy. Tell your providers, tell the nurses, PTs, tell them to tell their people.
Yes.
Maybe it doesn't even need to be the person but maybe their network is who needs to really hear about this. So spread the word about this and sign up for HFA's email list if you're not already on it. Now, this next segment is brought to you by Genentech. The Genentech Patient Foundation is dedicated to making sure that people with hemophilia can get access to treatment. No matter what type of health insurance you have, and even if you have none at all, there may be some potential options available to help you afford your medicine. To learn more about these resources and to find out if you are eligible, visit www.hemophiliaaccess.com. One more time, that's www.hemophiliaaccess.com. Amy, we're going to now hear this conversation with the Hemophilia Alliance. Give us a little preview. What are we about to listen to?
We welcome back to the podcast 2 members of the Hemophilia Alliance who work in the Member and Community Relations department there, Zack Duffy and Roland Lamy, who I adore. I really love these dudes. And when I interviewed them for the gene therapy segment that was released a few weeks ago, when we concluded that interview, they said, hey, we really should get on the podcast to talk about this alternative funding program situation. Those of you that are well-versed in advocacy fights with our community, which so many of us are in the bleeding disorder community, we're so educated. We've heard about these accumulator adjustment programs. We've heard about these maximizer programs that insurance companies are utilizing to try to cut costs. Third parties are kind of like sneaking in, and this is a new thing. And when Roland and Zack explained what this was to me, my jaw was on the floor. I purposely didn't do a lot of research coming into this interview because I wanted to be like a first-time listener so I could ask, probing questions, and I should have done research because I was stunned a little bit. I was like, wait, people are doing what?
Yeah.
So anyway, it's something that's happening that we should be aware of. So my interview with Zack and Roland will hopefully lay it all out. And this is not the only time that we're going to be hearing about these particular programs that are happening in our insurance space.
Alternative funding.
Especially if you're in employer plans. So self-funded plans, which so many of us get our insurance plans from our employers, from, mid to large employers. That's where some of these third-party companies are coming in for those high-cost drugs. So anyway, it's important, and we'd love to hear some of your feedback, and I'm sure we'll continue this conversation. But here's my conversation with Zack and Roland. Y'all, like I said earlier, I am back with Roland and Zack from the Hemophilia Alliance. And I just want to say at the end of our last conversation, the both of you said, hey, by the way, there is this thing that is creeping. It's becoming prevalent. Prevalent? Is that a word? Prevalent. Oh my God. Prevalent. In insurance plans, especially looking to 2025, you had some urgency about wanting to talk about kind of the next iteration of the accumulator and maximizer issue in alternative funding programs. And so we immediately scheduled a time to talk about this. And on purpose, Zack and Roland, I did zero research. And so I guess to start us, tell us a little bit about why the urgency, what is starting to happen, and how will patients be affected by these programs?
Yeah. So I think I always like to kind of level set a little bit, right? So we have copay
Mm.
accumulators out there, and that's essentially when all copays don't count for the patient, right? So we have copay maximizers, and that's when plans alter their copay amounts to maximize the amount that a manufacturer would give for patient assistance through a copay card or something like that. And these alternative funding schemes is what we're calling them right now, just because there is no name. But we're
Mm.
identifying where it's harming patients and their ability to access medication. So ultimately, someone has insurance. That insurance should pay for the medication that their doctor prescribes. In this case, um, a third-party vendor enters the chat and takes the prescription and says, we will still get you your medication, but that's actually through the manufacturer patient assistance program, free drug through the manufacturer. And so those manufacturer programs aren't set up to be a pharmacy for patients, right? They're not there for 24/7 emergency situations. They're really set up for patients who don't have insurance. And this is essentially taking that medication that should be filled at a pharmacy, doing a lot of things in the background, and then making it look like the patient doesn't have insurance to those programs.
Whoa.
So
Whoa.
there's a lot
Like
that
my
goes on.
mind broke a little bit. What is the and I guess Roland, I guess I'll turn it to you. What is the thinking from a fiscal perspective? Like, why would insurance companies do this or a third party do this?
Yeah, so these third parties are emerging, right? They're generally for-profit entities providing a service. They generally get paid as a percentage of the savings to the health plan. And what they have sort of accumulated is a lot of knowledge around manufacturer assistance programs that are either generated as by the manufacturer. Sometimes they're funded through government agencies, but they're really intended for people with significant financial need. And so what they do is they, as Zack was saying, they carve the benefit out for certain specialty medications. They force the patient or the consumer, the covered person, to access product through the vendor, and the vendor sort of acts as a facilitator to the patient assistance program. And there's some ramifications to that, right? So that's not why these programs were set up, number one. Number two, you might be on a product that the vendor may try to push you to a different product because of available manufacturer assistance. So, same product, might be more than one product to treat somebody with factor VIII, for example. So you could end up potentially being pushed to a different product, or at least attempted to be pushed to a different product. And then there's all sorts of other unintended consequences. As Zack mentioned, you might not get assistance, you might not get copay accumulators or those kinds of things. I think the biggest issue is that because manufacturer assistance programs were not set up for this purpose, a manufacturer might say, hey, we need to tighten the reins tighten the program on this assistance plan. And then the consumer gets left out, right? So if it cuts off mid-year and your benefit already excludes it, what happens? I mean, basically, your only option is to present yourself to the emergency room, which is not exactly where you want to get your care and your product from. So, I think that there's just a lot of unintended consequences from this. And really, the whole goal is to save money to the plan. Milliman did a study. Milliman Actuaries did a study, and they sort of hedge their bets on whether there's long-term savings in the aggregate from this, because there's a fiduciary responsibility of the sponsor of the health plan. And so if people run out of care, run out of coverage, run out of product, there's still got to be a way to access product. And, forcing people to the ER and those other things is not a particularly economical solution.
Mm. Zack, both you and Roland work at the Hemophilia Alliance. Both of you are part of the member and community relations team. Tell me a little bit about your role with the HTCs in particular surrounding issues like this, insurance issues like this that might affect those affected with bleeding disorders.
Yeah, I mean, we get calls from our treatment centers that say, we've submitted an authorization for this patient. It's been denied. And now the patient received a call from one of these vendors. And they don't always present themselves as this vendor. It seems like they're part of the PBM or the pharmacy network, right? And during that call, they're telling the patient, oh, we need you to sign some paperwork. But that paperwork includes a limited power of attorney. It includes things like a release of medical records, including mental health records or substance abuse records, things that they don't need, but they are making the patient feel like they have to provide that in order to get their medication. And so the patient's kind of caught up like, oh, I need my medicine. Let me sign up for these things.
Yeah.
The treatment center is working in the background saying, oh, well, this pharmacy denied it. Maybe we can try another pharmacy. So they're spending a lot of administrative time calling, going through the list of pharmacies that the insurance has set up and trying to make sure the patient has medication. And you can imagine, this can happen all of a sudden where the patient doesn't have medicine on hand. And maybe there's an issue where they need medication sooner than later. And so there's a lot of scramble at the HTC. How do we make sure the patient has this medication? Obviously, HTCs want to prevent the ER visits. Sometimes in these situations, that's where the patient has to go to get that medication. So our HTCs are concerned both on the administrative work that's happening to ensure patients have access to the meds. Patients are worried about what information they're giving up to get on this medication. And then sort of unbeknownst to the patient, because they signed this power of attorney, because they've given them access to the medical records, they're filling out the patient assistance forms on behalf of the patient and submitting it. So the patient doesn't even know where the medicine's coming from. And that's really problematic, obviously, is like, who do I call? How do I get these meds that are so important to me in a timely way? And so sometimes those alternative funding vendors will act as that third party. Oh, tell me how many doses you have on hand and what the strength is. They take that information. They then will call the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer will send the meds to the patient. So it becomes very convoluted for the patient, complicated. A lot of people are putting in a lot of work to make sure a patient's okay, but sometimes it's hard to know who's on first.
Oh my gosh. Are these third-party vendors being contracted by the insurance companies? Like, is this like a...
They usually, they're typically...
Is this...
Yeah, they're typically brought in maybe by brokers, consultants, in an attempt to sort of offset renewal costs. The insurance plans themselves, maybe not necessarily. They are... Generally, these alternative funding programs are sort of standalone businesses of their own. So they're marketing, hey, let us help you. Your drug costs are rising. And the good news is we don't charge you anything unless we save you something. So it sounds like a pretty good deal. And I think that's the issue.
And Roland, actually, that's a good clarification. This is happening mostly in self-funded employer plans. And so for those of us, explain that to me and to the audience like we're in third grade. What is that? And yes, please.
Yeah, so it's a little tricky to explain, without a whole bunch of slides. But in a self-funded employer-sponsored program, the employer is essentially piecing together a health plan, choosing a network, choosing a claims processor, choosing a prescription benefit manager, choosing to pay claims themselves, and buying reinsurance for high cost claimants, for example. So they're essentially, the self-funding aspect is that the employer is paying the bill for the insurance program, and by virtue of that, they hold a lot more decision-making authority than, say, a small account that, small employer who goes out and buys a Blue Cross or a United or a Cigna health plan. They're beholden to the rules set by that health plan. But the majority of people in the United States are covered under these self-funded programs, large employers making decisions with counsel. They get good consultative advice from brokers, large brokers. And this business has emerged, another sort of vendor with, the marketing pitch that they're going to save you money. So it gets a lot of attention because specialty medications are on the rise. And, in some cases, they're about a third of your overall premium in terms of the cost of them. So it's an important issue for sure. But, I think there's just a lot of implications, maybe not well thought.
Roland or Zack, whoever wants to take this one, what's happening with the 340B pharmacies in terms of this issue? Are plans typically having, two choices of pharmacy, a 340B or another pharmacy, or this alternative funding program? Or is it just like, are the 340Bs being completely cut out?
Yeah, well, remember that when these programs are set up, they don't distinguish between 340B and non-340B plans. I mean, there are complications of being a 340B entity in self-funded programs where the employer chooses a pharmacy benefit manager that has exclusive rights to distribution. And so they shrink the network and sometimes carve our hemophilia treatment centers out of network, even though we may be a better and more economical option. So they do that because they have their own distribution capabilities and they want to make the surplus on drugs. It's really not a distinction between 340B and non-340B. Remember that the core issue of this alternative funding program has to do with qualifying patients who meet the financial test, the needs test, right? Because these premium assistance programs that they're generally using through the manufacturer have a means test. And so the plan might say, well, these manufacturers cover people up to 300% of the federal poverty level. If you're above 300%, we'll cover you on the traditional plan. But if you're under, we're going to push you to this alternative funding mechanism, which brings into question, what kind of information do I know is being sourced out about my economic means? Are there HIPAA considerations? Are there tax implications? Has the employer violated its fiduciary responsibility to the plan? Is it discrimination? So I think it exposes the employer to a lot of legal issues that nobody's really ever talking about. And as a patient, I may not know what information is being provided to these vendors.
For sure. This is giving me anxiety. Everybody, I should have done research before this so I could have been prepared for the anxiety inducing. Okay, so if you're a patient, how will you know that this is happening to you? And what do you do? Does it get down to the patient? Is the HTC kind of the first line of defense, or does it trickle down to the patient and the patient alerts the HTC that this is happening? What have y'all seen? Should the patients look out for this, and what should they do?
Yeah, I think from a patient perspective, oftentimes the treatment center will receive a denial for an authorization for the medication. And then sometimes the next step is that the one that was reviewing that and denied them reaches out to the patient and says, oh, we're going to get you set up on a new pharmacy plan. This happens, a patient might switch from specialty pharmacy A to specialty pharmacy B throughout, when plans change. I think sometimes our patients are used to having to re-enroll in these things. Mm-hmm. It just takes a little bit of this feels like a red flag. And I think if a patient has questions during that, they should reach out to their HTC and say, hey, I got this packet of paperwork, or I got a phone call saying this. Does this seem to jive with what you know about my benefits plan? I think patients we all have spidey senses at some point. And I think when we feel that like this doesn't seem right, we should start doing a better job of talking together. Like, hey, HCC, is this correct? HCC to patient, hey, we seem to get a denial from you. Let's work through what this looks like in the next steps. And I think it just requires a lot of communication between both parties.
Yeah, I was going to just add, I think what the core of what Zack is getting at is it's really important for patients to understand it's okay to advocate for yourself. The unfortunate byproduct of some of this for people with severe illnesses and severe diseases is that sometimes they need coverage, they need the product, and they're reluctant to ruffle feathers with their employer, right? And so, but I think it's really important for people to understand there are rules. There are things that they have as rights. Their plan has a fiduciary responsibility. They have a right to equity amongst the employees that are in the account. There are provisions in ACA sponsored plans that protect them. So they have rights. They have to get educated about those rights, and they have to be willing to advocate for themselves, so they don't just get left out in the cold and have to go to the ER for care. And so that can start with the Hemophilia Treatment Center, because there are teams of people with been through just about every issue. They have no problem advocating for patients. They have us at the Hemophilia Alliance in the backdrop to help guide the situation. But it's really, really critical for the message to be that it is okay to advocate for yourself in these situations.
Are patients, can they say no to these programs? And if they do say no to these programs, like where will they get their medication?
Yeah, some of the way these programs are written are pretty tried and true. And so sometimes they don't have immediate options, but I think they start to raise questions about the program and the way it's structured, and get, appropriate counsel from treatment centers, from us at the Alliance, from other member advocacy organizations. I think it's probably not something they're going to turn the needle, turn this on a dime and move the needle right away. But I do feel like it's something that they're going to have to continue to advocate for, because while they may not feel as big an impact in the short term, although we have had some cases that have been emergent, the longer term aspect of this is where I think the concerns are. Keep in mind too, as Zack was pointing out, if people have immediate bleeds or need product immediately, some of these patient assistance programs take up to 3 or 4 weeks to even render an opinion about the application. So this is not a perfect science.
Yeah. And do you think where this is going is patient advocates and HTC advocates speaking to their employers about signing up for these particular programs, identifying these programs, and like, here are some ways to maybe cut costs that wouldn't necessarily be as clear? Is that where we're going?
There's a white paper out there right now
we love a white paper.
Yeah, and it's aimed at employers about how alternative funding schemes are bad. And it goes into all the points that Roland was talking about. I think too, we have employers that buy into these programs. They're looking for savings, right? Costs are high. You can't blame someone for thinking, okay, how do we help reduce the costs so that we aren't increasing our premiums? So sometimes the employers don't even know what they signed up for. And what we found is when we talk to the HR department, sometimes those HR folks are like, oh my gosh, we had no idea this is what we did. That's not what we were told. That's not what we were sold. We will help make this right.
Right.
I will say there are other employers who know what they're getting into, and that is a much more difficult conversation because they are much more embedded in that savings and can be more standoff to the patient. And that gets really complicated. And why I think it's important to engage with local advocacy groups, national advocacy groups when reaching out to your HR, so you know you have some support there, and how to navigate that, and knowing your rights, as Roland pointed out earlier.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see manufacturers get a lot smarter about this and what they require for evidence. One of the questions might be on the application for financial assistance or product assistance might be, do you have access to health coverage? Or does your health insurance plan cover these products? What's the answer to that? If you know that, you make $50,000 a year and you qualify, but somebody, across the hall makes $300,000 a year and they can get product traditionally through their insurance plan like anyone used to. So what's the real answer when you're asked, does your insurance cover this product? So I think you're going to see manufacturers get a lot smarter as this thing expands, because it's their dime.
Yeah.
And
Run 100%.
so I feel like eventually it's going to restrict what's available for people that are in great need. These programs weren't. It's like the marketplace exchange. It wasn't set up so that employers could dump high-risk people to the marketplace exchange because they could get subsidies on their premium. That's not what the purpose of the marketplace exchange was. But I think some of these well-intended mechanisms like exchange subsidies and premium and product assistance and those kinds of things, they're just being exploited. And I think the rules will just tighten eventually.
Y'all, thank you so much. It feels like this is just like the start of this conversation, and we'll continue to talk about this. Before we go, just wanted to ask y'all, where can patients go in particular for more information to kind of educate themselves even further about this issue? Where can patients go?
So NBDF is working on their insurance toolkit, which I think is a great place for patients to go in this period of time, right? Open enrollment's coming, understand what a lot of terms mean, deductibles, coinsurance, all these things. But they are also working to identify these, reaching out to your hemophilia treatment center. Oftentimes there's people there that can help you work through your insurance options. They can't always point you to which one to pick, but helping you understand those, or referring you out to an insurance specialist in your state who may know the different opportunities available.
Yeah, I'd say, Google is your friend. It's sort of like, I can.
Whoa, no one ever says Google is our friend. Really, Roland?
I feel like, you can fix your lawnmower with a YouTube video now. So I feel
Yes,
like, if people Google pharmacy benefit alternative funding programs, funding programs, you'll see a lot of information out there. I'd encourage people I think a great resource is the Milliman white paper. The Milliman actuarial white paper is a really great resource. But there are tons and tons of information, and you'll see pros about it and you'll see cons about it. In all the resources you pick, but it's important to kind of get educated on what it is, and what the potential ramifications are to you as a consumer. So, there's a lot of information out there, and it's going to be more and more and more as this thing expands.
Roland, 100% going to put in the program notes. Roland said, Google it. Like 100%. That's what it's going to be, which is funny. That's what my husband says all the time. If I ask him a question about, like, how do you mow your front yard, or how do you turn on the lawnmower? He'll be like, Google it. So anyway, psyched about that. Well, thank you to the two of you. I know, it was lovely meeting you when we recorded our gene therapy segment a couple of weeks ago, and how lovely to have you back so soon. And now that I know that you're a resource, you'll never get rid of me. Wah, wah.
We're here for it.
You're going to have to come talk about this stuff. I really appreciate the work that you do with our treatment centers and for our patients. I mean, it's sometimes hidden work. Not sometimes. I feel like a lot of stuff that the Alliance does is very hidden from patients in particular. So it's really lovely to bring that to the light and to let them know that you guys are on this and a part of the awareness and education moving forward. So thank you.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
There are so many myths and misconceptions about gene therapy treatment, even for the most well-informed, educated patient. Context, as you know, is extremely important, but also what works for one treatment, one patient, might not necessarily work for another. So in today's segment, I've asked Dr. Mark Redding and Dr. Stephen Pipe to break down the common misperceptions and myths around gene therapy for hemophilia, and in particular, for Hemgenix, the Hemophilia B gene therapy treatment. This segment is brought to you by CSL Behring, a global biotherapeutics leader focused on serving the rare disease community by providing innovative therapies. They now have a first-of-its-kind treatment for hemophilia B. To learn more about this treatment option, visit beyondhemb.com and download the B Support app from the App Store or Google Play to stay up to date on relevant information and to manage your treatment journey. Our guest today, y'all, Dr. Mark Redding is a hematologist who sees patients at the Center for Bleeding and Clotting Disorders in Minnesota. And Dr. Stephen Pipe is the medical director of the Pediatric Hemophilia and Coagulation Disorders Program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They both speak nationally about gene therapy, about the patient response, and about the data that has been published to date. All I can say is both know their stuff. So let's start off with a bang. Let's really go big or go home with this myth stuff. What is the biggest myth out there about gene therapy? That gene therapy is a cure. Let's hear what Dr. Mark Redding has to say about that.
One of the myths, and maybe it's not a myth, it's more of a misperception, is that it's a cure. How do you define cure? And everybody will have a little bit different definition perhaps, but this doesn't cure hemophilia. If this works really well in you, this could be a really good treatment for you, but it may not work as well in you. Okay, so that we can't call it a cure if there's that chance of it not working very well in a given person.
So one thing that I have heard from patients who are educating themselves about gene therapy, but keeping a healthy distance from an actual decision, is they are waiting for over 5 years of data to be released before they move forward with making that decision. They want to see how long the factor gene expresses before making that call. It sounds smart, super smart, right? Well, actually, there's a bit of a myth to that, because for Hemgenix, the gene therapy treatment for hemophilia B, well over 5 years of data has been published. Here's Dr. Stephen Pipe to tell us all about it.
You may remember that some of the early clinical work in patients with hemophilia B was reported around 2011 through 2014. Well, fast forward, those gentlemen now have been post-Hem B gene therapy with AAV factor IX for more than 12 years now, and the data is showing that they are still expressing factor IX over that whole time period. So all of that went together to give us some confidence that if we had the right vector and transgene combination, we could get durable expression of factor IX in patients with the best risk profiling.
Another misperception about gene therapy is the amount of steroids that are needed to offset immune responses. Here's Dr. Mark Redding to explain.
So steroids is another hot button topic. So to kind of just backing up a bit, like what's the deal with steroids? And by steroids, we don't mean like the bodybuilding steroids, like get your muscles huge, right? We mean corticosteroids, the one that people commonly know as prednisone. And these are medicines that we use to sort of tamp down immune responses. So when we deliver gene therapy, that vector gets into the liver, delivers the gene, that causes some inflammatory immune response in the liver. And if that happens to enough of a degree, we worry that there could be damage to the liver or that maybe the treatment won't work. And so in the clinical trials, we've used steroids to kind of blunt that immune response. Now, the question is this. In some of the clinical trials, most of the patients have had those kinds of immune responses and needed steroids. In other trials, there's been a lot less of that. So in the Hemgenix trial, I think, for example, it was only about 20% of patients that had their liver enzymes elevate, indicating that kind of a response. And most of those patients were treated with steroids. In some other clinical trials, it's been more like 60% of the patients. In others, it's been up to 80% of the patients. Part of the issue when we use steroids is if we use steroids for a short period of time, it's not such a huge deal. But if you need to be on them for a while, there are some side effects. They're not horrible side effects. They're not usually permanent side effects, but it can be pretty bothersome, especially if you end up on steroids for a long time. And in some of the clinical trials, people have needed steroids for many weeks. And that's kind of a bummer.
So another common misperception is that gene therapy treatment will alter or modify your own genome. Now, while we know that that is true for other gene therapies, that's called gene editing, for hemophilia A or hemophilia B, gene therapy would deliver a working copy of the faulty gene into the liver cells with instructions to produce the missing clotting factor. Dr. Pipe can confirm.
Well, we're not changing your own genome. Your hemophilia doesn't go away genetically. If you have a daughter, your daughters are still going to be carriers.
Okay, here's another one. This is a really big one that we've heard. When it comes to hemophilia B gene therapy, another myth, again, that you might have heard, is that if you have an AAV neutralizing antibody, your body could potentially block the treatment, rendering no factor expression response. We've heard that a lot. Let's hear from Dr. Pipe, who breaks down this myth.
There's a couple of aspects that I think your listeners should understand about AAV gene therapy. And the first one is, AAVs are naturally occurring viruses. We all encounter them in the wild. They don't cause any disease, but we mount antibodies against them potentially. And for almost every platform of therapy that's used AAV vectors, they have screened patients out if they had a certain level of antibody that had the potential to neutralize the virus and basically block it from getting directed to the liver. And so that was a real exclusionary aspect of AAV gene therapy up until this point. Uniquely to this trial with this product, we had some early data that suggested that having AAV neutralizing antibodies might not be an impediment to getting a good outcome with this treatment. So boldly, that small study we did with the first 3 patients with the Padua variant, we enrolled them knowing what their neutralizing antibody titer was, but we didn't exclude them from participating. And they got that really good expression. So that emboldened us for this big phase 3 trial not to screen patients out based on neutralizing antibodies. And what we observed is that except for a single patient who had a really, really high titer, probably at the 90 or 95th percentile of the normal population, he did not get a good response. He didn't respond at all. So there does appear that there's probably a threshold there, but it's not clear where that threshold is. We had all the rest of the patients, about 42% of them had neutralizing antibodies, and up to a titer of about 1 to 700. This is the dilution of their plasma that was used to make this calculation. They all seem to have good response and no safety issues related to neutralizing antibodies. So to date, this is the only AAV gene therapy program that does not exclude patients based on AAV neutralizing antibodies.
So who is gene therapy for? We say those with severe hemophilia, but is that only based on factor level? Dr. Mark Redding explains.
It's only for people with severe hemophilia, and severity isn't defined just on factor level. Severity includes just what's your bleeding tendency, and so that's sort of a separate conversation. But you have to have severe hemophilia.
So because I am a nonprofit nerd, my personal favorite myth is that gene therapy is too expensive. There's no way a payer is going to pay for this. However, that is turning out to be a myth. Dr. Mark Redding explains how expensive gene therapy is and if there really is a barrier to access.
So far, that has not been as much of a sort of deal breaker as I think we thought. I mean, it's super expensive, right? There's no question. But look, treating hemophilia is super expensive. The current treatments we have are very, very costly as well. So, initially when you look at that price tag, people are like, oh my gosh, this is so expensive. And, unfortunately we see stuff that makes it to the newspaper, like most expensive treatment ever approved. And that's not helpful to the conversation because when taken out of context, it doesn't really tell the whole story. I mean, treating hemophilia is really, really expensive with the current therapies we have. So that's the first thing to sort of say that. We've been talking about this for a long time. There've been a lot of conversations nationally with the different patient advocacy groups, talking with payers, helping understand, this is going to be really expensive, but what are we getting for that? And you have to compare the cost of how much it costs to treat hemophilia the way we're currently doing it, and if gene therapy, although it's a one-time really expensive cost, if that means you don't need to use factor anymore, over time that's going to pay for itself. And so getting back to the predictability issue, that's really where the hook is, right? So if you knew this was definitely going to work for you and you wouldn't need factor anymore, then you can do the math and figure out at what point the cost savings would kick in. But because we can't predict how well it's going to work for a given person, and not everybody's going to be able to stay off factor entirely, that makes that long-term kind of cost analysis a lot trickier. So I will say, though, I think that the payers understand this. We've been having lots of conversations as a community, and the payers have been at the table with those conversations. I think everybody understands that, it's expensive, but we have to think about it in the right context and think about, at some point this should be cost effective if we can avoid using factor. So in general, I would say this hasn't been as big of a barrier as we maybe thought it was going to be. There are still some issues to be worked out, and we're just starting to use commercial gene therapy now. More to come on that, but I don't think we should look at this as the insurance companies are going to say no, you can't have this treatment.
Good stuff, right? We learned something, right? Awesome. Do you have another myth or a misconception about gene therapy that's been bugging you? Let us know all about it. We have info in the program notes for how to get a hold of us. And once again, this segment has been brought to you by CSL Behring, which now has a first-of-its-kind hemophilia B treatment. Visit beyondhemb.com or download the B Support app wherever you get your apps for more information.
Thank you to Luke and Roland. Thank you, Dr. Redding and Dr. Pipe, all for joining the program today. Thanks, as always, to our presenting sponsor, Takeda, bleedingdisorders.com for more. Gene therapy segment sponsor, CSL Behring. And thank you to our show sponsors, Pfizer and Genentech. We really could not produce the Bloodstream podcast without your support, and we are extremely grateful for it. Thank you. Bordeaux, I have a question. Mm-hmm. Can I still call you that?
Yes.
Okay.
That was also my nickname from college. It was like a beloved nickname of mine.
Yeah, I didn't make it up. I'm not trying to take
credit. I'm just saying like it's, yeah.
Yeah, I'll keep it going.
Okay, great.
Because Brado, no one ever has said, that's never been anyone's nickname for a reason. I've been trying it on. So Bordeaux, our next episode comes out October 25th. What can listeners expect to hear?
Well, we have a new segment of I'm Fine, which will be spectacular, I'm sure. But we also, coming up either next week or in the weeks to come, we have an announcement about the next documentary film that's coming from Believe Limited.
How about that? Kind of
a big deal.
If you were at the Hemophilia Foundation of Michigan, you may have heard it announced by a certain someone. There's a teaser for those who can't wait until October 25th. Dig around and do your homework. And with that is all for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast if you somehow haven't already, wherever you listen, to have the next episode delivered to you the moment it goes live.
And as always, mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com is where you can email us to inquire about casting opportunities, which there will be some really cool casting opportunities coming up. So again, that's mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com, or you can find us on social media. Myself.
If you're audio only, she pointed at me.
Yeah, I pointed at Patrick.
She said
myself, me, but also Patrick. We're all on social media.
It's true. It's unavoidable for better and for worse. And yes, indeed, I am host Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your other host, Amy Bradford.
And until next time, take self-care of yourself. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.